Okay, good morning. Welcome back to Managing the Insider Threat, What Every Organization Should Know. It's 11 o'clock, and our next presentation is Components and Considerations in Building an Insider Threat Program, presented by Carly Huth and Robin Ruefle. Carly is an insider threat researcher in the Cyber Enterprise and Workforce Management Directorate in the CERT program, and her current areas of research include the intersections of privacy and technology, as well as the effects of the current regulatory environment on insider threat prevention practices. Robin Ruefle is also a member of the technical staff within CERT, and Robin has co-authored numerous books on CSERTs, as well as being an adjunct faculty member in both the continuing education and MBA programs at Chatham College. Robin, Carly, good morning. Welcome. Stage is all yours.
Good morning. I'm Robin Ruefle, and I'll be presenting today with
Carly Huth. I look forward to talking about policies and practices with you in a little bit, but I'm going to hand it over to Robin right now.
Thanks a lot, Carly. Well, good morning to all our remote viewers. We're really glad to have you here today, and we're looking forward to talking with you about building an insider threat program. So many organizations today are very interested or actually doing some planning to build an insider threat program. Now, that interest might stem from the fact that they've had some organizational requirements or some even mandates to build a program, such as Executive Order 13587, which mandated that federal agencies that operate or have access to classified networks must build an insider threat detection and prevention program. Interest has also been sparked when we see when an agency or an organization may be the victim of malicious insider threat activity. And of course, many organizations are trying to be proactive and actually define and expand their security program and their incident response program to include methods for handling insider threat. So today, what we're going to talk to you about are some of the key components that you would include in any type of insider threat program. And we're also going to talk about the considerations, things you really need to take into account when you're looking to build such a program. Building on top of that, we're going to start with talking about a motivation for the program itself. And tying back into that executive order, one type of motivation, of course, is to have very safe protection and information sharing for classified national security information. But there's other type of information that's not classified or necessarily sensitive. It might be proprietary information that also has to be protected, such as intellectual property, including trade secrets. It could be proprietary source code, and of course, PII. It could be that you're trying to protect a process that's within your organization. So, for example, in some one insider threat case that we've seen, where in one particular state's Department of Motor Vehicles, the actual clerks were paid by an external collaborator to give licenses to people who really weren't qualified to have those licenses. So you want to protect those types of processes too. And of course, the motivation is to know what you need to do. If there is a potential for malicious insider activity, then who needs to be involved? How does it need to be handled? What needs collected? What needs reported? And you want to have this already laid out in a plan so that you're not trying to figure it out while the incident's ongoing. You may see this particular slide in a lot of CERT presentations and publications. And what this slide really shows is the whole timeline for the activity of the insider, the malicious activity. So beginning on the left, this might be circumstances that are occurring that may be making an employee feel that they're not appreciated, or maybe there's home activity that's going on that's causing them stress, and that stress is translated to the workplace. And as they move forward, it could be planning what they're going to do, acting out, and performing some malicious activity, and then actually the damage that's caused, whether it's causing sabotage on a system, stealing proprietary information, or something like that. This slide also shows you the opportunities for prevention, detection, and response to an insider attack or malicious insider activity. And so you can see that it has prevention, detection, and response components to it. And this shows you that there are many different opportunities where you might be able to collect various indicators, technical indicators as far as someone using a computer system in an inappropriate way, accessing things outside normal working hours, printing lots of activity, or it could also be speaking out at work, complaining, harassing other employees, accessing materials that they don't have need to know or that they are not supposed to access, things like that. So what this timeline shows is that all along the way of when the malicious activity is being planned and then actually executed, there are different places where you can notice those technical or behavioral indicators. So the goal for any insider threat program should be to build in the mechanisms and the processes for prevention, the detection, and the response along that whole timeline. So prevention might be having background checks in place, or it could be teaching managers and supervisors how to actually recognize the disgruntled employee and then having an employee assistance program available to get that employee to before something more serious happens. Detection might be building infrastructure controls in. So, for example, using tools like data loss prevention to keep proprietary information from going out of your infrastructure, or at least detecting when it goes out of that infrastructure. And response is, again, having those policies and procedures and processes in place so that if something happens and it is detected, who needs to be involved, who needs to do the analysis of what happened, and who needs to be involved in the resolution. So all of those things together show you the scope of your insider threat program. So now we're going to move and take a look at some of the key components that you want to include in an insider threat program. These are high level, and these are not comprehensive. There are many other components that we could talk about, but these are some of the key ones we wanted to talk about today. One of the most important pieces is to ensure that you have cross-organizational involvement. There are many stakeholders from across many different parts of the organization that need to be involved in planning and implementing any type of insider threat program. And we'll look at that in a little bit more depth. Also, you want to identify what's already in place, because there already may be policies, procedures, information assurance, processes and mechanisms in place that you can build on and leverage. You must think about what kind of staff is going to be involved in any type of insider threat program. Is this a program that you have enough resources and funding for that it's going to be an ongoing operational program where they're going to be performing activities day to day? Or is this going to be a part-time program? Or is this going to be pulled together subject matter experts? And think about, is it full-time, part-time? Is it a combination of both with some key people who might be doing data collection and analysis and some subject matter experts from areas like legal counsel, HR, or even counterintelligence, if that's appropriate to your organization, may be pulled in as needed. But you also need to think about any program you may stand up. If there's any type of monitoring and analysis that's going on, is there a group that's actually watching the watchers? So who's performing quality assurance and ensuring that those people aren't abusing the access that they have? We also look at training and awareness programs, and we have a slide coming up where we'll talk about the fact that it's not just normal security awareness training about insider threats for all your employees. There's other types of training that have to be done at different levels. We'll talk about that. Of course, a key component is building the infrastructure itself, and this can include not only building in information assurance practices and processes, defense in depth. Many of the types of activities that you might do to protect your organizational infrastructure from external attacks will also protect from insider attacks. And there are additional things that you need to look for, in particular on the behavioral side. So having that infrastructure already in place to do that prevention and detection. And then as part of that infrastructure, building some type of cross-organizational data collection and analysis capability and figuring out what that is. Also, what type of an incident response plan do you have to have in place for when you're handling an incident that's been perpetrated by an insider. Very often when we talk to organizations, we see that they're using their existing incident response plan, using their information security and their computer security incident response team or the security operations center may be involved. But as you expand and develop the program, there may be a different incident response plan. Maybe there's a specific piece of it that is geared just for insider threat. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We also see as a key component of building an insider threat program is to ensure that you enhance your existing policies, procedures, practices, processes to support that insider threat program and ensure that insider threat initiatives, insider threat policies are included in what's already established. And Carly's going to talk about some of those areas later. No matter what you do, though, and in building your insider threat program, one key tenet is that you have to make sure that you're protecting the civil liberties and privacy rights of the employees of your organization all the way through your supply chain, contractors, trusted business partners. And that is something that must be taken into account at all time. So as you build the program, you want to ensure that you're involving privacy and legal and human resources. And to take a look at that in more depth, this next slide actually can be used to represent a couple different ideas that we're going to talk about. So the first thing is that this is a notational diagram that could show a sample type of organizational structure for a program that is operating on a daily basis. You can see the cross-organizational aspects of this by looking across IT, physical security, human resources, and legal counsel. But you can also see down below, this gives you a lot of the different people that are involved and considered stakeholders in building and operating an insider threat program. And you may say, well, I look at that and I wouldn't have thought about that person being involved or that group of people being involved. So for example, the data owners. Well, data owners are the group that are the custodians of the data. They're the ones that are going to set the access and requirements for access and also the sensitivity levels of the data. They need to understand for an insider threat program why their data might be targeted and how their data might be targeted. And that's just one thing that they need to think about. When we look at, for example, contracting group or COTAR, they have to think about what type of information might go into any contracts that they build or execute that says, if I have a contracting group, will they ensure that if there's a problem with one of their employees, potential insider threat or actual malicious activity, does that information actually get sent up to the hiring organization and do they know about it? Is it built into the contract that you are actually responsible as a contractor for adhering to the security policies of the hiring organization? And that's just a few samples. So again, it's very important to think about who needs to be involved in the planning, the execution, and the operation. And it's probably vaster than you might normally think. When we talk about training, and I mentioned before that we're really thinking about multi-level training and awareness. Certainly, as we said, all employees should have some general awareness training and refreshers geared to insider threat. They should understand, what does the organization mean by insider threat? What are its definitions? What type of insider threat crimes and activities and the motivations behind them exist? And that can be in general, or that could be specific to your organization. How can staff themselves be targeted or social engineered to give access or to give assistance to external collaborators? Also, what type of information to support? What's suspicious? And how would they report? Is there some type of confidential reporting system as far as reporting not just computer activity, but also suspicious human activity? And are there acceptable use policies that you must follow for working on computers or working in an organization? And not just the use policy itself, but what are the repercussions so that employees know if they violate this policy, this is what they can expect to happen to them. And that all employees have a responsibility for protecting their intellectual property data and systems, and a responsibility to report any suspicious activity if that's a policy that you're putting in place. So those are just examples of training. But role-based training is very important for all those key stakeholders that I talked about on the previous slide. So is there special training there is special training, or there should be special training for members of the HR staff. For example, that could be enhancing their termination checklist to ensure that all types of access, physical and electronic, have been removed, and working with IT and security to ensure that that occurs. For facilities, as an example, is there training that janitors might need to have so that they understand when they might see suspicious activity occurring, or people there in off hours that shouldn't be there, or lots of printouts in the garbage, something like that. So there's a lot of different role-based training that should be established. And then if you have a formalized insider threat program and designated staff, they need to be trained specifically on how to execute their duties, what are their roles and responsibilities, and again, in their day-to-day operations, how do they ensure that they're not violating the civil liberties and privacy of the rest of the employees in the organization. We talked some about infrastructure support, and we look at prevention and detection, the infrastructure components that have to be in place. And that includes building the monitoring system for what needs to be monitoring, having capabilities to filter and block information from exiting the infrastructure, but it also means building the data collection and analysis mechanism, including understanding what data needs to be collected, how it needs to be synthesized and aggregated, how is it going to be stored and protected, what kind of repository, and what type of data, what type of behavioral and technical indicators are going to be collected. So that's another part of the infrastructure support that needs to be determined as you go and build an insider threat program. As we follow that up and talk a little bit more in depth about data aggregation and analysis, we mentioned the types of data to be collected. One of the things to keep in mind that data is usually scattered across the organization. So that means that you need to understand who owns the data, where the data is located, who actually has authority to give you access to that data and permission, and how can you actually obtain that data. And what type of criteria you're going to use for any type of monitoring, any type of data aggregation and collection. What type of scoring criteria? What results in an alert where an investigation may need to be prompted? So these are all part of laying out the basic components of your insider threat program. And specifically, how is that escalated? Who actually gets those reports? And it may be different in different cases. Every organization is going to have its own needs, and every organization is not going to have the same insider threat program. And so you have to build that program looking at the culture, looking at the resources, looking at the expertise, and looking at the funding available in the organization itself. We mentioned building an incident response plan for insider threat, really detailing out how the incidents that are perpetrated by an insider might be detected. Again, how are they to be reported? And we're looking at multiple reporting mechanisms. So is there a confidential reporting mechanism? Who gets those? What happens to the information? Where does it get passed to? What if a question comes into the help desk? Who do they escalate that information to? What are appropriate methods for containing information from going out of the system or to contain the threat that the insider has? And what happens if something needs to be prosecuted? Who needs to be involved? How is that passed on to law enforcement? How is legal counsel involved? Usually, the normal incident response plan that you might use for IT security incidents needs to be enhanced. It's not always the same people are going to be involved. There's probably a higher level of confidentiality that needs to be in place when you're actually monitoring or looking to stop, contain, or catch the insider themselves. So what are the processes that you have to do that and to protect that data too? How might that process, that incident response process, change? If it's going to be different people involved probably in the organization, if fraud is being done versus espionage, where it might be a totally different group of people who are involved for the investigation and the resolution. And also think about and take into consideration how the process could change when involvement includes contractors, trusted business partners, What about when you're looking at privileged users and what they have access to? If you have information on cloud computing servers or in data centers and you don't actually own the supporting infrastructure, and even unions. For example, if you're building your process, it may be that a union representative has to be involved as you're talking to the person who may be accused of performing malicious insider activity. Also, you should designate out your response options, thinking what is appropriate response internally. And it's not always that it's going to be something that's sanctioned or prosecution-based. Depending on the severity of the actual activity, it may be that that employee can be sent to an employee assistance program. Maybe there's some retraining involved. Maybe it wasn't malicious. Maybe it was unintentional and someone didn't understand how they were supposed to operate a piece of equipment and how they were supposed to protect the data. But there could be personnel actions and various organizational sanctions ranging from letters of warning to suspension to termination or prosecution and other legal actions. So again, who makes the decision? Where is that in your chain of command? Where is that in your incident response plan? What are valid options for particular types of activity? And if things have to go to an external source, such as an investigative unit, or to local or federal law enforcement, who actually handles that liaison activity? And who actually passes that information on? Who passes the data on? How is that done? So all of these different things need to be considered when you're building your response plan and resolution process. So remember to think about documenting those policies and procedures related to response so that you can ensure everyone understands them and performs them in a consistent fashion. And also that any type of process that's developed should go through your legal counsel, possibly human resources, possibly other parts of the organization, IT security, CIO, CISO, things like those types of areas. And think about not just response to when the actual damage has occurred, but is the response that can occur up front when there's just precursors, when there's just maybe an indication that someone may be a potential threat. So again, we look at, can management and supervisors be trained to identify those types of precursors? And can that employee get some retraining or get some assistance ahead of time so it doesn't get more serious? But again, remembering those privacy and civil liberties must be considered at all times in all procedures that you build for response. And that's a nice segue into Carly talking about policies and procedures.
Thanks, Robin. I think Robin did a great job underscoring how important policies are in an insider threat program. That being said, I think it's also really important to notice that you can't just have those policies documented somewhere where employees can't access them. Policies really need to be well communicated to all employees. In addition to that, policies really need to be updated. We recommend, number one, that you have a regular cycle of updating policies, and number two, that you also update policies if there's a change in the law, if there's a change in technology, etc. There have been definitely court cases out there that have been more difficult for employers because they don't have those up-to-date policies, and so employees are bringing in new technologies into the employment environment, but those aren't covered by policies. And so the employees don't really know what is their expectation of privacy in these new technologies. There are a lot of different policies to cover. Some of them have to do with human resources, so reporting mechanisms, for example. Do you have a confidential process for talking about any kind of concerning behaviors that they see in the workplace? These might be technical, these might be just arguing with other employees, etc. In addition to that, are employees required to report, or is it just suggested? These are just really nuances in the language of policies, but they're really important. There are a lot of information technology related policies and procedures that are out there too. Acceptable use is a big one. Sometimes you might find this in an employee handbook. Other times you might find a warning banner on a computer system that talks a little bit about the acceptable uses. Are you allowed to look at your bank account? Are you allowed to look on Facebook? All of these are considerations for an acceptable use policy. But beyond just on the network and systems, you also have to consider acceptable use of iPads, of telephones, all of these different technologies that are coming into the workplaces. Really important to be considered. In addition to that, there are other IT policies, including not sharing accounts, not sharing passwords, separation of duties, code reviews. All of these are really crucial policies and procedures. Moving on from that, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission last year came out with some guidance surrounding background checks. So, as you know, background checks are one of the foundational tenets of a good insider threat program, making sure you can trust those employees before they come into the workplace. However, there are some legal considerations. So this really underscores the importance of bringing in your legal counsel when you are considering different insider threat policies. So the first consideration is that even neutral policies have been found to violate the EEOC guidelines, and that's because they harm certain protected classes. So some organizations have gotten in trouble in the past because they've basically banned anyone with any kind of criminal background, and that can be sort of dangerous. Obviously, you have to talk to legal counsel about your specific situation, but just knowing that those guidelines are out there is pretty important. Also, organizations need to be careful. A lot of times they should be looking for not arrest records, but rather conviction records. This is important because a lot of times arrest records aren't complete, or even then the person was found not guilty. So things like that really come into play. And you'd hate to be looking at a candidate and doing the wrong thing with their information because you don't have all of the background information on them. It's really important to train all of your HR and other relevant staff members on these guidance. There's a little bit more to talk about here with the EEOC guidance. They recommend targeted screenings. And basically this means perhaps for a banking candidate, you're looking at fraud convictions and other related convictions like that. You also really want to look at how long ago the convictions took place and really the nature of the job. Is it a very trusted position? Or is it perhaps something where they don't have access to a lot of your foundational assets? There are many other legal considerations when putting together an insider threat program. We're only going to talk about a few of the basic ones. The first is creating, maintaining, and enforcing acceptable use and monitoring policies. We already sort of touched on this, but I think it's really important to underscore having both the acceptable use and monitoring policies. Some organizations put them together. Other organizations inform employees separately what they can and can't do on the systems, and then also what the employer has the right to do on the systems. You can see this, as I mentioned before, sometimes in an employee handbook, other times on the web banner. It really just depends on the organization and how they bring in legal counsel and IT and what works best for them. Second, it's really important to obtain employee acknowledgement of the policies. This is because in a lot of court cases, they're looking for the intent of the employee. And so if you show that they were aware of the policies and practices, then you have a better chance of proving the intent of the employee. Again, sometimes this is through the click on the warning banner. Sometimes this is a signed acknowledgement. There are many different ways that employee consent is obtained right now. The third important consideration, you can't just rely on policies, particularly in cases of trade secrets, for example. Courts are really looking for the employers to have protected these trade secrets through other technical measures. For example, maybe you have that separation of duties in place, or maybe you only let certain employees know about the trade secrets, so limiting the access. There are many different technical and even some non-technical measures that go beyond the policies that are in place. Additional legal considerations include making sure that you consider the need to review logs in your data retention plan. So there have definitely been cases out there where the organization finds out that there was harm to the organization 60 days later, but their data retention policy says only keep logs for 30 days. Obviously, it's a lot harder to prove that the harm occurred if they've already gotten rid of those logs. Sort of a related consideration to that is making sure to preserve all evidence in the correct and proper manner. And one of the ways you can really do this in an insider threat program is to make sure you have that buy-in from all of the different people, from the IT, from the HR, from the legal, and make sure you have that training in place so that anyone who is responding to an incident is aware of how to do this. Finally, it's also really important to issue prompt legal response. This doesn't always have to be when you know harm has occurred. A lot of organizations will have some kind of termination checklist, which includes sort of re-acknowledging policies and practices, but just always making sure that you are active and responding quickly with your legal response is important as well. So I'd like to end with a little summary here of some topics that we've discussed today. There's some really important considerations to think about in the first 30 to 60 days, even a little beyond that in your insider threat program when you're standing it up. The first is to get the management buy-in. Obviously, this is really an important consideration so that you have that backing of management. It's also really important to start to define the different roles and responsibilities that everyone in your insider threat program will play. It's also important to decide what your most important assets are. As Robin mentioned, that doesn't necessarily have to be intellectual property. It might be PII. It might be credit card data. There's a lot of different information out there that can be considered an asset to a potential criminal. It's also really important to start to think about the organizational structure of your insider threat program. Again, as Robin mentioned, this can take many different shapes depending on what your organization looks like. So if your organization is very small, you might only have a few people part-time. But I'd like to mention if that is the case, we've seen organizations with the best practice that they're still meeting regularly even if there aren't incidents. So even if you don't have someone full-time on this, just making sure that they always get together, even if it's just monthly or more or less than that, so that they all have the information about what's going on with the organization. Maybe you have a lot of terminations coming up. Maybe you have a bump in hiring. Either of these can be sort of at times of more risk that you'll want to get people together and sort of discuss how best to move forward with your insider threat program in these instances. So after the 90 days, there are still many considerations. We have a few of them highlighted on the slides here. The one I'd like to talk about is making sure that you understand all the different data sources that your organization might hold that can be important for an insider threat program. And as Robin mentioned, making sure you have the correct authority to look at those different data sources. It's also very important to start understanding what capabilities you'll need in your insider threat program. David Mundy this morning talked about our work in insider definitions. And so it's really important for the organization to have that insider threat definition for their own organization because it will help you decide what capabilities are necessary for your program. Depending on how you define assets or even insider themselves, do you consider contractors insiders? Do you consider other trusted business partners and vendors? That will really shape how what your insider threat program looks like and who is responsible for that program. So we'd like to leave you today with a top 10 list for fighting the battle against insider threats. Again, I'll just go through a few of these quickly. The first of which is to bring in your legal counsel. But beyond that, as we've mentioned several times today, making sure to pull from many different sources. So you want to be talking to the people who deal with contractors. You want to be talking to HR, IT, all the data owners. And making sure to train all employees is so important. Another important consideration, again, is to decide what those assets that you most want to protect are and make sure that those are definitely have that extra line of protection in there. And finally, just getting started on your insider threat program. So you need to be talking to management and deciding what that looks like for you. And so from there, I believe Robin and I will be answering some questions today.
Great. So thanks for your presentation, ladies. So some questions coming in. So we'll address the first one from Venkata asking, for reporting purposes in this process, do you follow XBRL standards or do you have other recommendations for reporting?
I am not immediately familiar with those standards, and quite honestly, it depends on your organization. Particularly for international organizations, the reporting requirements might look very different, particularly around whether or not you can have things like anonymous reporting of issues, or whether or not you have to collect certain data about the employee. So those are all pretty important considerations. In addition, it really depends on what industry you're in. For example, government employees have certain reporting requirements that they must meet, but other industries, it obviously varies.
Okay, Pamela asks, do you have any recommendations about handling an employee who is displaying precursor behaviors? Robin mentioned retraining the person, but if they are truly a bad insider, won't this tip them off that they are being watched and possibly result in the person becoming more devious and harder to detect? When would you recommend firing the person or taking stronger action than retraining?
There are a lot of different issues that were brought up in that question, and many of those really need the guidance of the legal counsel and human resources, because they're the ones that are going to best know how this should work in the organization itself. Now, the question that you bring up about tipping off someone, certainly when you think about how you're going to approach such an issue, it depends on each individual case too. So it depends on the severity of the activity, it depends on what's actually been happening, and it depends on what guidance that you have from human resources and legal counsel. But if it's a situation where it might not be so severe, where it really is, maybe it was unintentional, maybe it was a mistake, maybe the disgruntlement can be found to be related to stress that's going on, and that employee can get help before it gets too serious. That's what we're talking about when we talk about really looking at those precursors. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would like to add a little bit. In addition to what Robin said, I think there are a lot of other mechanisms in place. For example, we have metrics around the 30-day rule, which is when someone resigns, perhaps watching them a bit more closely. But nothing says that that's the only time you might want to watch an employee more closely. So you might want to put additional monitoring in place in certain instances when you would see certain precursors. In addition to that, there are performance plans and many other things you can do besides retraining before you might get to that termination step. But as Robin says, every instance is different. You've got to talk to your HR, legal counsel, and probably the manager as well.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, Ben would like to know, would you advocate departmental training, mixed team training, or whole organization training on this topic?
That's a great question. And really, there's a combination, I think, of training, too. So the organization, I would think everyone in the organization needs the basic training for just what insider threat is and how they can be targeted, and understanding this as a particular type of attack. As far as different groups being trained together, when we talked about the role-based training, I think that may tie in. There may be specific, like I'll take human resources as an example. There may be specific people in HR that need to have more in-depth training because of the role that they're going to be performing, but probably all of HR needs more training than just the normal employee awareness, I think, that goes on. And I think there was one other type of training that was mentioned.
Departmental mixed team training or whole organization.
And we have seen organizations do mixed team training. So we have seen them bring in like many of the stakeholders together so that they all not only hear the same information, but they can use it to help together work on building what that insider threat program and plan is, ask questions, and understand each of the different parts of the team and parts of the group's responsibilities, how they can work together as a team. So that is certainly an option. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you covered it perfectly.
Just to follow up to that, are you familiar, is that what the Insider Threat Workshop does? Does it bring stakeholders within the organization together? Or have either of you worked on a workshop? Or it could be a question for another staff member, but it sounds like it's probably bringing stakeholders together.
Both Carly and I have taught portions of the Insider Threat Workshop, and yes, it certainly could be brought. We have brought it on site for organizations, and they have pulled together different members of the team or different parts of the organization to hear that training together. But the training is also offered to the public, so it's not just geared to be a team-based training, but it can be used as that. It can also be customized.
Is that something you guys dictate who should be there, or do you let the company kind of decide for themselves?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
If we're coming on site, we will talk with them about who, depending on what their intent is. Is it just general awareness, or are they building a program? So we will actually help them and identify maybe what the intent is that they're trying to accomplish, and then we'll use that to maybe make some recommendations, but in the end it's up to the department how they would like to do the training.
Okay. A question from Tim asking, from your experience, what is the biggest hurdle in an organization's establishing a formal insider threat prevention program? Is it money issues, legal issues, technical expertise, something else? And earlier, I know Tim had asked about the cost for starting a program. He got our "it depends" answer, so I don't know if you have a varying answer to that, or if it truly depends, which is probably the case, but I'll let you take it from there.
I'll start not with the cost, but with the biggest hurdle. And in my opinion, that's just realizing that the insider threat is a problem for your organization. A lot of times we don't see organizations implement an insider threat program until they've already had a pretty damaging incident. And so obviously we have a lot of guidance on our website, and maybe taking some of those case examples to management to show the potential harm would be a great way to combat that hurdle, in my opinion.
I agree, Carly. I think that getting people to be aware of the problem and to see that it touches so many different parts of the organizational operations, and that you can leverage a lot of what's already in place. So you don't have to start over, but you can build upon things that are there. And very often people don't realize that either. But I do think that all those other issues are very difficult problems. Organizations run into resource and expertise levels, and so it's good to also not look at what exists in your organization, but there are other organizations out there doing things too. And so you can take a look at the types of programs that are being put in place and what they've required, and depending on the organization you are, maybe talk to people in your same sector and see what they're doing, and they may be able to give a clearer picture of cost, because cost is really going to depend on the type of organization you are, the sector you're in, how big your organization is, and how many different services you need to add or expand, and what type of expertise you're going to expand. So, you really hate that it depends, but...
Yeah, Tim, I tried. I tried to get you a formula, but that is a difficult question. Next from Ben asking, how do I know how my insider threat program compares to other organizations? Is there a repository? Is there a community?
Sure. So one way is actually that we do insider threat assessments, and this is based on our empirical data of over 700 insider threat cases. So oftentimes we have organizational practices that didn't quite work out for the organization that was attacked, and so we've taken those and developed best practices. That is sort of the opposite, what went wrong and what the organization can do to combat that insider threat. And so by offering the assessment, we sort of validate those different practices with the organization.
Okay, and the last one in the queue here so far, folks, and if you have other questions, feel free to type them in. We have about 3 minutes left in this presentation. Was from Gene, and a comment I'll read to see if there's anything you want to address is, what is not mentioned in this presentation is the fact that those employees that work in the National Industrial Security Program and hold a security clearance fall under the same regulations as a government employee who holds a security clearance. Additionally, the guidelines for granting them a clearance and reviewing the information prior to submitting them for a clearance is exactly the same. Great presentation. So I don't know if there's any reply or anything you want to address there?
No, I think it's important to note that certain employees are under more scrutiny, and certainly cleared employees have that sort of threshold that they have to meet. But that's by no means the only sector that has employees that sort of meet additional scrutiny. The banking sector, a lot of their employees, the casinos, for example, there are a lot of industries out there that have a certain higher threshold of scrutiny for their employees as well.
Okay, Robin and Carly, go ahead, sorry, you had to add something, please do.
I actually wanted to go back and address, was it Ben that was trying to get the cost information?
Tim, I believe,
Tim?
yes.
Oh, sorry, Tim. What you might want to do is also look for other resources that are available online. Other organizations are in the process of putting together some different types of cost models for their particular sector. So I don't have that information right now, but that might be something that you might take a look at depending on the sector that you're in.
Great, thank you. That clears the question and answer. Carly and Robin, thank you very much for sharing your expertise.